I'd like to begin with a toast, some good Canadian whiskey. This is a toast in honor of Pardes, in honor of Purim, and in honor of Zoom, L'chaim, L'simcha L'shalom.
Amen.
If this were the Beit Midrash, I would have thought twice and three times before having a toast, but it's my study. All right, you get the idea, people. We're going to be studying about Purim this morning. And on the one hand, I would say Purim is entirely conventional. It's part of the holiday cycle, like all of the other holidays. And all of the other holidays, by the way, like Purim, commemorate some critical moment in Jewish history. The Exodus from Egypt is commemorated by the pilgrim festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. So that's on the calendar. That's sort of the underlying structure of the calendar are those three festivals which remind us of the Exodus from Egypt. And later on, as we make our way through history, we pick up some other holidays or commemorative days along the way. So the destruction of the first temple and the events surrounding it are commemorated by fast days. 4 fast days, actually. The 10th of Tevet, the 17th of Tammuz, the 9th of Av, the 3rd of Tishrei. All of these days are associated with the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. And then we have the events of Purim during the period of the Persian Empire. And the salvation of Purim, destruction imminent, led to some intervention and salvation. And we commemorate it with Chag Purim. And a little later, a few centuries later, we will be threatened once again by the Syrian Greeks. And we will be preserved. And Hanukkah will be born. So what I'm saying is, if you sort of consider the holidays or the commemorative days on our calendar, Purim is very much part of the larger pattern. And if I were to distill the fundamental idea of Jewish holidays and commemorative days into 1 or 2 sentences, I would say, all of these days acknowledge the fact that the Jewish people are a small people trying to navigate history in a world which is ruled over by empires much more powerful than they are. Whether it's the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans or everything that follows up until the present day, that is our predicament and our potential. Because with every interaction with a larger empire, there is an exchange. It's a cultural exchange. Sometimes that exchange is a function of hostility, and sometimes it is amicable, but that, as it were, is our fate. A small people navigating history which is ruled over by much greater empires. And in that sense, Purim is like any other holiday on the calendar. But of course, you know and I know that Purim is also fundamentally different. The way we celebrate it is nothing like any of the other holidays. Purim is boisterous, and Purim is frivolous, and Purim is drunken, and Purim is coarse on some level. There's none of the solemnity that we associate with the other festivals or the other days. The Gemara has the audacity to say, and every yeshiva boy has memorized at least this Gemara, Chayav inish livsume bepuraya, a person must become drunk on Purim, adelo yada, until they cannot tell the difference between Arur Haman, cursed be Haman, Uvaruch Mordechai, and blessed be Mordechai. So that's not just recreational drinking, that goes beyond. By the way, in contrast, we also have drinking on Pesach. It's called the 4 cups of wine. But that never translates into some sort of an invitation or a call to become drunk. So there's something unusual about how we celebrate Purim and how we commemorate it. By the way, I'll just point this out. For those that are more reluctant to become completely drunk, so of course somebody came along and interpreted that Talmudic statement. It just turns out that the numerical value, the gematria of Arur Haman, 502, is exactly equal to the numerical value gematria of Baruch Mordechai. I can't go through the calculation now, but try it at home. Both of these phrases exactly add up to 502. So the creative take on that Gemara is you don't have to become so drunk that you cannot tell the difference between these obviously completely fundamentally different characters in the story. It's enough to become drunk such that you can't do the math. Who can add up these numbers and then do an equation to figure out that it's exactly 502 on each side? That's enough. So obviously that's a lower level of inebriation, but it's also not the pshat. And certainly the way Purim tends to be celebrated on the street, so to speak, is more in accordance with the straightforward reading of the Gemara, which is complete inebriation. And that, of course, is unprecedented, I would say, in terms of Jewish commemorative days. So there's something strange and unusual about Purim. By the way, this led a modern scholar, Dr. Adele Berlin, who chaired Jewish studies at Maryland University for many, many years. She developed the idea that Purim actually is, quote unquote, an etiology, which means there's already an existing practice called Jews having fun like everybody else. Carnival, if you will, Mardi Gras, if you will. Every society, every culture creates carnivals. What happens in carnivals? You get dressed up, you get drunk, you have fun, you make trouble, hopefully nobody gets hurt. That's what carnival is about. Adele Berlin says, yeah, Jews had one of those too, or at least they were part of cultures that celebrated such things. How did they kosherize their version? They created a story called the story of the Megillah. They created a story called the story of Purim. So that is at once an acknowledgement of the uniqueness of Purim, even as it undermines, as it were, the traditional conception of Purim as commemorating particular events in Jewish history. But it sort of highlights just how unusual the situation is. I'd like to add to this factors which perhaps exacerbate the situation, and that is that in the rabbinic literature, there is a lively debate about the inclusion of Megillat Esther into the canon of the Hebrew Bible. Does this book belong or does it not? I'm going to do a share screen with you if you have the sources in front of you. It's going to be source number 1. I'll read it in Hebrew. You can follow in English or in Hebrew. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda shalcha lahem Esther lachachamim. Esther sent a message to the sages at the time. Kivauni lidorot. Set my story forever for all generations. Make it part of the canon. Shalchula, they sent a message back to her with trepidation. Kin'a at me'oreret aleinu levein ha'umot. That will, as it were, create rage against the Jewish people among the peoples. Here are the Jews celebrating the downfall of their enemies. were reluctant, therefore, to include Purim as some sort of an eternal commemoration by creating a canonical text. Shalcha lahem, she responded, Kfar kituva ani al divrei hayamim lemalchei madai faras. She said, it's already been recorded by the nations of the world in the annals of the Persian kings, as the Megillah itself testifies. And so there is a debate here, a discussion. Should Astaire be included, the story of the Megillah be included, the text of the Megillah be canonical or not? I'm skipping a little bit. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shemuel, Astaire does not defile the hands. I can't go into the meaning of that phrase now, except that in rabbinic literature, it is a key term to identify a text which is canonical. That Shemuel therefore believed that Astaire was recorded without divine inspiration. He himself said, Astaire b'ruach hakodesh ne'emra. Rather, Shemuel understood recounting the story, obviously, has validity, ne'emra likrot, v'lo ne'emra lichtov. However, recording the story as canonical text, there's no such thing. So it begins really as a Tanahitic debate in the first centuries of the Common Era, apparently continues into the 3rd and 4th century of the Common Era, because Shemuel, the Amora, is still wondering whether, in fact, the book of Astaire should be included in the biblical canon. So that's kind of striking. And we have debates about other books, as you can see in this source, but none of those debates extend into Jewish history for as long as the debate around Megillat Esther. Let's do a little bit of history, just to get a sense of the context here. Basically, the period associated with Purim is what we call Shivat Zion, or the return to Zion. Remember that the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Jewish people were exiled to Babylon, and there they remained for the better part of 7 decades or so. And eventually the Babylonians were overthrown by the Persians, or the Medes. Cyrus the Mede became king, and in a very famous proclamation, which is recalled in the book of Ezra as well as in extra biblical sources, Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild it, and to rebuild the temple. And all of that happens in the 6th century, as I've noted here. Just in terms of creating a link with the biblical material, anyone who is bolded on this chart is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. So Cyrus is mentioned in the book of Isaiah, without getting into the whole debate now, because Isaiah really lived centuries before Cyrus. So Deutero-Isaiah, whatever the case may be. These are the prophetic characters or the Jewish leaders who are associated with the Persian king and his era. And this is the political leader associated with the restoration of Jewish life in Jerusalem or in the diaspora. So Cyrus utters that proclamation, and the Jews begin to return. But it's really just a trickle, led by an obscure character by the name of Sheshbazzar. Nevertheless, this movement gathers steam, and eventually under Darius, the temple, the second temple, will be rebuilt. Daniel, Haggai, and Zechariah are the characters, the spiritual leaders, the guides, and the teachers, and their books, obviously, are part of the Hebrew Bible. They are the ones who are active during the period. Darius is succeeded by a king called Xerxes. That's the Greek name for the Persian king, and these are all the Greek names for the Persian kings. And we know with a fair degree of certainty that Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BCE, which means the story of Purim takes place approximately 3 centuries before the story of Hanukkah. there is a debate. Is Xerxes to be identified with Achashverosh of the Hebrew Bible or not? And the prevailing opinion says, yes, he is. Achashverosh is the Hebraicized version of the Greek-Persian Xerxes name. And we know a lot about Xerxes from extra-biblical sources. He spent most of his time fighting the Greeks and losing. He spent most of his time carousing and drinking. And much of the tone of the Megillah very much is reflected in the reality of Xerxes' reign. And if he in fact is Achashverosh, then that means we can more or less pinpoint the activity of Astaire and Mordechai to a number of decades in the 5th century BCE, which is of course striking. That, as it were, is the historical frame. And you can see from here, another way to think about it is that the events of Purim occur late on the biblical timeline. The biblical timeline is almost finished. It's really just Ezra and Nehemiah, the 5th century, the late 5th century BCE. Soon, under Darius III in the 4th century, the Greeks will defeat the Persians. Alexander the Great will conquer the region, and that's already after any of the events mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, with perhaps the exception of the apocalyptic visions in the book of Daniel. But pretty much the end of the Hebrew Bible more or less coincides, so to speak, with the events of the Megillah. And that, in fact, might be part of the debate as to whether this book ought to be included. As prophetic inspiration disappears and dissipates, these are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the final prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps there was a feeling that as important as the story of Purim was, remember Shemuel said, we have to recount it, it could not be included in the Hebrew Bible because the prophetic or the age of prophetic inspiration was already over. Perhaps that was the reason. In the end, of course, it is included. And that's source number 3. The Talmud in Baba Batra clearly indicates that Megillat Esther is part of the 3rd division, Ketuvim, the writings in the Hebrew Bible, and it ascribes the composition of Megillat Esther, or at least I should say, its official inclusion to the group called Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Basically, they are people who are active, a group, a legislative body, a judicial body, a religious body. Traditionally, the men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, had 120 members, which of course would one day inspire the Knesset of the modern state of Israel to have 120 members of Knesset. In any case, here the Talmud says it's Anshe Knesset Hagdolah who are responsible for writing, quote unquote, or perhaps editing, or perhaps including the scroll of Esther in the Hebrew Bible. And there it remains. So in the list of prophets and prophetesses associated with the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud in Tractate Megillah will say, of course, in spite of the fact that there are many, many prophets active in ancient Israel, only those who had a message for posterity are to be included in the canonical text. And among that august group of prophetesses responsible for generating biblical text is none other than Esther. So Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Abigail, Huldah, and Esther really are the 7 prophetesses that receive official recognition in the Hebrew Bible as having that status. And of course, you note, Esther really is the final character on the list. Okay, so even though a debate swirls around the inclusion of Megillat Esther in the Hebrew Bible, in the end, it is resolved, as you can imagine, because if you open any Tanach today, you will find in the writings Megillat Esther and the story of Purim. I'll just point out one salient detail, which may or may not be germane to this discussion. Among all of the thousands of fragments of biblical text which were discovered in the region of the Dead Sea, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls, every single biblical book was represented, and many non-biblical books, except for one, which is Megillat Esther. There wasn't a single scrap or fragment of the text of Megillat Esther which was discovered. That does not mean it was not in existence. It just means it wasn't discovered. But it is curious that of all of the biblical books, only that one, as it were, was not represented, perhaps or perhaps not, reflecting an expression of this controversy that we are discussing. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. If there are any questions or comments before we go on, I'm going to have a sip of whiskey. Oh, that's good. Any questions or comments? Let's go on. Okay. I'm almost tempted to say that the debate around Megillat Esther led to an overcompensation in terms of halacha, which is that Megillat Esther is the only part of the Hebrew Bible for which a parchment scroll is mandated in order to undertake a public reading. Obviously, that's true of the Torah scroll, but it's not true of any other text in the Hebrew Bible. To read the Haftarah, I do not need a parchment, although in some communities it is the custom. To read one of the other Megillot, to read Tehillim, whatever it is that I'm reading publicly, I do not need a scroll written on parchment. But in order to fulfill the mitzvah, quote unquote, of hearing the reading of the Megillah, the rabbis mandated that it actually be recorded on parchment after the manner of a Sefer Torah, and in the absence of that, the reading is invalid. Which is why all of you who have to prepare for the Purim reading have to do so much work. Because you know that the scroll has no punctuation and the scroll has no vowels and therefore requires preparation ahead of time. But that's highly unusual. Why was it mandated? Why was the Megillah given that status? I'm tempted to say it was a direct reaction to this debate, lest you think that Megillat Esther does not belong in the Hebrew Bible. We will indicate to you beyond any shadow of a doubt that in fact it does. And so that, as it were, is the counterpoint to the question about including Megillat Esther in Kitvei HaKodesh. Okay? There's one other major problem with Megillat Esther, which makes it absolutely exceptional and in a class of its own, and I'm sure to no small measure was part of the controversy surrounding the story. And that is that Megillat Esther makes absolutely no mention of God's name, not even one. No fleeting reference. If you ever did a wordle of the Hebrew Bible, you would discover that the word that occurs with the greatest frequency, not counting particles like et or something like that, the word that occurs with the greatest frequency in the Hebrew Bible is, not surprisingly, God's name. Of course, what is the Hebrew Bible if not, as it were, the record of the encounter between God and human beings, between God and the people of Israel? That is what the Hebrew Bible is about. And here we have a text called Megillat Esther, which completely breaks with every other biblical text because God's name is not mentioned a single time. Now, it is true, there's something called the Song of Songs, Megillat Shir Hashirim, which has a theme that, if taken literally, might be somewhat out of place in the landscape of the Hebrew Bible because it's a love story or a romance or erotic, whatever you want to call it. But guess what? God's name is in there, at least as a fleeting reference at the very end, right? Love is like a burning flame, says the author. Shalhevet Yah, God's fire, that's love. It consumes and it burns. It warms also. So God made it into Shir HaShirim, and he certainly made it into most of all the other books. And not only did he make it in, but he's center stage. And here we come across Megillat Esther, and he's not mentioned even once. What could possibly be the meaning of that? So according to Adele Berlin, the meaning is clear. If Purim was an ideology to kosherize carnival, we all know what goes on at Mardi Gras. It's no place for the name of God, for goodness sake. And so therefore he's excluded, so to speak. This is not a text that we want to put God into. That would be her interpretation. Among the medievals, we have the interpretation of the Ibn Ezra. I'm going to go back to a share screen. And this is in source number 5 on your sheets. I'm skipping a bit, we'll come back to this stuff. Ibn Ezra says, Ibn Ezra is, of course, the great Spanish commentary of the 12th century. Great is God, he says, above every praise. You only have it in Hebrew. There is only help from God, he says, the one who writes the statutes of his laws on the heart of the one who reflects. Whoever heard, Ibn Ezra says, of saying a word, of uttering a sentence without mentioning the name of God? B'hinei ein b'Megillah hazot zecher Hashem, but there is no mention of God's name in this scroll. V'hi misifrei hakodesh, and nevertheless it is included as part of the holy writings. And there were attempts to find allusions to God's name in the text, but guess what, says Ibn Ezra? None of them are the straightforward reading. Hanachon be'enai, what appears to me, Ibn Ezra therefore concludes, this Megillah is written by Mordechai, I would say Esther, because that's what's reported in chapter 9. Nevertheless, Mordechai sends the books to the various communities to commemorate the events of Purim, like a letter, a patshegen, which is a Persian word, Behe'etikuha Parsim. And the Persians copied the story. It became part of their history too. After all, this was a story about the Persian Empire and about Xerxes and his rule. And it was written in the chronicles of their kings. And as I said, the Megillah itself makes it clear that that is the case at the end of the story. Behem hayu ovdei avodah zarah, but the Persians are idolaters. And you know what happens when you translate things? It's not simply a translation of the words, but every translation involves a cultural transformation. If the name of God would have been recorded in the Jewish version of the story, that name would have been substituted by the name of a Persian deity, just as the Kuthians did. When they wrote the Torah, or they translated it, Bereshit bara Elohim, they said bara Ashima, not Elohim created, but Ashima did. That was the name of their deity. B'hinei kvod Hashem, therefore it's actually to the glory of God's name that Mordechai not mention it. So it's not that far from Adele Berlin, but it's actually worlds away from Adele Berlin. It's not that the story of Purim didn't happen. It's that the story of Purim happened and happened. And because it happened, and because it was recognized, and because it was commemorated, and because the Persians took note of it, they recorded their version. And in recording their version, had God's name been mentioned, it would have been substituted for a Persian god. Ibn Ezra was well aware of what happens when the Hebrew Bible is translated by other peoples into other languages, because often that translation is done with an agenda. When the Vulgate will translate the Hebrew Bible into Latin, all of a sudden, the young woman of Isaiah chapter 7 will become a virgin, with all of the implications now placed on the biblical text of a virgin birth. That's what happens when biblical stories are taken by others. Today we would call it cultural appropriation, by the way, but whatever. When biblical stories are taken by others, translated into their language and their culture, naturally things are adapted to suit the message of that culture. Better to leave God's name out than to have it replaced by a Persian deity in the Persian version of the story. Ad kan divrei Ibn Ezra, that is Ibn Ezra's theory. Let's have a quick look at the narrative events of the Megillah. You have it in your sources beginning on page 7. And I'm going to go through it rather quickly because time is of the essence. Just one sec, I have to close the door a little tighter. Okay. I love Debussy as well, but if I don't close the door, that will be in the background, which isn't bad. Zoom it is. All right, in the 3rd year of his reign, Achashverosh holds a feast for 180 days. That must have been the feast of all feasts. Imagine a king who has to hold a feast for 180 days for his ministers and servants. That's a king that has a serious lack of confidence. And if we were to do like a character sketch of Achashverosh, we might come away with a profile of a man that needs reassurance and support, that needs to be told that he's right, that needs to be told that he's good, that needs to be told that he's effective. 180 days of feasting to win the loyalty of ministers and servants. And that's followed up by a 7-day feast for the entire people of Shushan. The whole city can run through the palace grounds. In the meantime, Vashti the queen holds her own feast for 7 days. I don't know for how long. Vashti holds her own feast for the women. And on the 7th day, the king demands that she appear before the ministers and the officers. The rabbis will add naked, and she refuses. And therefore she is deposed. And therefore a new queen is sought. And all of that are events associated with the 3rd year of Achashverosh's reign. It will not be until the 7th year that Astaire will be chosen as his queen, which basically means, to put it in, how shall I say, straightforward terms, there's basically 4 years of state-sponsored rape in which the king gathers all the virgins from his empire and tests out which one will be chosen to be his queen. And of all the fine young women, it turns out to be Astaire, and a feast is held in her honor when she is coronated in the 10th month of the 7th year of Achashverosh's reign. Mordechai is already a court Jew before the arrival of Esther on the scene. Mordechai and Astaire are, of course, related, Mordechai being Astaire's uncle. In any case, there is a plot to assassinate the king, which is uncovered by Mordechai, reported to Astaire, and told to the king in Mordechai's name, and the events are recorded. At the beginning of the 3rd year, Haman is elevated to prominence. Sorry, the beginning of the 12th year. Okay, so basically we have a 5-year period in the story in which there are no narrative events. There's nothing to report. And now the action picks up in the 12th year of Ahasuerus's reign, and every single other event in the story will be associated with the 12th year in quick succession. Mordechai refuses to bow down to Haman, and in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, Haman will cast lots in order to decide the most propitious day to destroy the Jews. That day will be the 13th day of Adar. That's the bad news. The good news is that basically gives Mordechai and Astaire almost a year to prepare. Imagine what would have happened if the lot would have fallen on the second month, the month of Iyar, or the third month, the month of Sivan. He casts the lots in the month of Nisan, the first month, and the lot determines the best day is the 13th of Adar, the 12th month. So there's a fair amount of time to prepare for that eventuality. Mordechai will mourn publicly in Shushan. Astaire will hear about it. She's not fully aware of the goings-on. She's part of the harem after all. She doesn't have access to the political information. Mordechai beseeches her to approach the king and plead on behalf of her people. She is reluctant to do so, having never revealed her identity, and also aware that to approach the king without an official invitation is a death sentence. So she says very simply, call a 3-day fast. Lech kenoset kol Yehudim. These are events associated with chapter 4. The left margin is the chapter. And after the 3-day fast, after the 3-day fast on the 3rd day, she approaches the king unannounced and invites the king and Haman to a feast. And at that feast, she invites them to come to a second feast. Obviously, that leads Haman to lower his guard. Little does he know what is in store for him. On the way home from the first feast, he crosses the path of Mordechai, who once again refuses to bow, and now Zeresh, his wife, encourages him to construct a gallows and to demand that Mordechai be hanged. That very night, the night in between the first feast and the second, the king's sleep is disturbed and the chronicles are read, and it is discovered that Mordechai saved the king's life back at the end of chapter 2. At that very moment, Haman enters to request that Mordechai be hanged. The king is just asking, has Mordechai ever been rewarded? The answer is no. The king turns to Haman and he says, have I got a job for you? You got to reward somebody who deserves reward. Haman says, it must be me. And he constructs this whole ceremony to reward the person who served the king with such loyalty. And here, of course, the story is already changing trajectory. The king says, perform that for Mordechai, which he does. And having done that, he is then summoned to the feast, the second feast, where he is unmasked. The king is incensed. There's a misunderstanding as Haman throws himself upon Esther's couch. And in the end, Haman is condemned to death. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8, Haman's decree still has to be rescinded. The king says, I can't rescind decrees, I can only offer new ones. And on the 23rd of Sivan, the 3rd month, barely a little bit more than 2 months after Haman cast those lots in the first place, on the 23rd day of Sivan, the messengers are dispatched, the Jews may defend themselves, and they celebrate the news with feasts. When the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar, rolls around, chapter 9, the Jews defend themselves and defeat their enemies. 500 are killed in Shushan, 75,000 are killed in the rest of the realm. This is not wanton killing. It's reacting to those Persians that used Haman's decree as a pretext to attack. Significantly, the Jews do not take the spoils. even though that was Haman's plan for them, to kill the Jews of the empire, to take their property and their possessions, and to turn that over, or some of it, to the treasury of the king. So the Jews defend themselves on the 13th of Adar, and on the 14th of Adar they feast, and in Shushan they continue fighting onto the 14th day of Adar, and the Jews of Shushan feast on the 15th day of Adar. And that's why we have what we call today Shushan Purim. Esther and Mordechai declare Purim as an eternal commemoration. So those are the narrative events of the Megillah, and as can be seen, it's quite clear, I think, that the idea of feasting is absolutely central to the story. Each fateful moment in Megillat Esther is associated with a feast, whether it's Achashverosh's feasts at the beginning and Vashti's feast, which leads to her downfall, whether it is the feast of the king and Haman, once they decide to destroy the Jews, that is then overturned when Haman will be exposed, whether it's the feast of Achashverosh at the beginning, 180 days and 7 days, which parallels the feasts of the Jews at the end, the feast of the 14th of Adar, and the feast of the 15th of Adar. So I'd say Adele Berlin is right. There's a lot of feasting in here. But I would argue that's why we commemorate Purim the way that we do. Because we are consciously evoking the events of the story, which revolve around feasts, without exception. How can we possibly commemorate the events of Purim without feasting in response? At the same time, I'd like to point out something which I mentioned earlier, but it's even more serious than we thought. It seems as if not only is God or God's name not mentioned in the Megillah, but when one reads the Megillah carefully, one gets the distinct feeling that God has been deliberately omitted. He has been written out of the story, almost like Ibn Ezra was claiming. It's not, Ibn Ezra's version is Mordechai and Astaire left him out because they didn't want his name to be substituted by a Persian deity. I'm saying it's not simply left out, it is deliberately omitted and actually written out of the story. And in order to emphasize that, I'd like us to just think of a few of the narrative events and how they would have been written in any other biblical context. So for instance, back in chapter 3, Mordechai refuses to bow. Anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible where there would have been a refusal to bow, we would have been told why. Namely, that devotees of God will not show obeisance to other human beings that claim divinity. And this is precisely what happens in the book of Daniel. Daniel's three compatriots, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as they are known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down to the idol set up by Nebuchadnezzar in spite of his decree. And they make it very clear why that's the case, because we are devotees of the God who created the universe, and we will not bow to an image made out of molten metal. So Mordechai not bowing to Haman actually is a classic opportunity to remind the reader that his loyalties are to God. That's called being written out of the story. when Astaire approaches the king with hesitation to invite the king and Haman to that first feast, we might have expected to hear the silent prayer that no doubt she utters in her heart. That would have been a moment to indicate to the reader that there is a prayer underway. Ana Hashem, please God, let me be successful in my agency. And by the way, that's precisely what happens in the Greek translation of Megillat Esther, the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, there is a chapter devoted to Esther's prayer. In Hebrew, you would say Zedavar mitbakesh, because that's what's required by the text. And if the Masoretic version won't include it, so to speak, so the Greek version will. All of that is a way of saying that the moment of Esther's approach to plead her case is a classic moment of including God in the story. Obviously, when the Jews are saved at the end and they celebrate, Hodu Lashem ki tov ki li'olam chasto, that would have been a moment to utter praise and gratitude. In the Gemara, there's actually a debate, should we be saying Hallel on Purim, should we not? The reading of the Megillah is a form of Hallel, or is it not? Whatever the case may be. Clearly, it's understood that being saved from certain destruction is occasion for expressing gratitude and praise to God. Call that the Pesach Seder, if you will. And yet none of that is mentioned in the Megillah. That's not called God left out. That is called God omitted. God written out. And I would say most spectacularly, the moment when Esther declares a fast, a 3-day fast in chapter 4, and the people fast and they don sackcloth and they sit in ashes. There's no such thing in the Hebrew Bible anywhere of declaring a fast without reporting that the people did tshuva and returned to God. That's the point of a biblical fast, for goodness sake. It's not about dieting. So clearly, that is a golden opportunity, the golden opportunity. I'm going to return to it. The golden opportunity for including God in the story, and he's nowhere to be found. Which is to say that he has been deliberately written out. So we're almost back to square one. How does this curious text merit inclusion in the Hebrew Bible when the author has gone to the great lengths of deliberately removing God from the story? And when God is removed, what are we left with? Intrigue, politics, power struggles, the story of a bureaucracy out of control, a king who's a narcissist and a megalomaniac, a governor, Haman, who craves nothing more than to get his hands on power, and the Jews' treasure. That's what's left when you take God out. Which is another way of saying it's sort of like reading the newspaper. That's what's left. How on earth are we supposed to understand the Megillah as having some sort of inspiration, divine inspiration associated with it, and reflecting somehow something about the divine encounter with the world and with human history? There are, of course, other interpretations. Some moderns read Megillat Esther as a satire, as it were, a social critique. That can take one of two routes. It might be a satire of the Persian Empire. Here's a king, as I have described him, drunk with power, in constant need of reassurance, always unsure and unconfident deep down. Here's a government which ostensibly is the most efficient, but is also the most inefficient, because the protocols will not allow a decree of the king to be changed. And some would say it is almost a Greek satire on the Persian Empire. This is, in fact, how the Greeks depict the Persians. They love to feast, they love to drink, they love to carouse, and they don't get a lot done. That's a Greek satire on the Persian Empire. And some will say that is the point of Megillat Esther. If I wanted to give it a more Jewish flavor, so Rabbi Menachem Leibtag explains that Megillat Esther is a satire, but not against the Persians. It's a satire against the Jews. Here's a community embedded in exile, living the good life in Persia, part of the court in Shushan, and they have completely forgotten their roots and where they ought to be at a moment like this, which is with their compatriots rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And so therefore, for instance, in chapter 5, when Astaire approaches the king, the imagery and the language is reminiscent, as Mish pointed out in a different context, of the high priest doing his temple service. Except that in place of the Holy of Holies is the throne of Achashverosh. And in place of the temple is the palace in Shushan. What a biting indictment of Persian Jewry, or so goes the argument. But none of that really addresses adequately what I'm claiming is the central issue, which is the deliberate writing out of God from the story. And in order to address that, I want to briefly turn to Nachmanides, the Ramban, source number 7. I'm going to do a share screen again, and then attempt to put it back into the context. Source number 6, sorry. By the way, at the end of your sources, you have some nice questions for self-study, whoever wants to continue thinking about the events of the Megillah. In any case, source number 6, Ramban will basically say, guess what, everybody? You may not know it, but the names of the months that we use these days are not authentically Jewish in origin. Back in the Torah, the months have no names. They only have numbers, ordinal numbers, the first month, the second month, the third month, the fourth month, etc. And the reason why they're ordinal numbers, first, second, third, and not cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3, is because ordinal numbers are about a reference point, and the reference point is the Exodus from Egypt. So the lack of the names of the months and simply assigning an ordinal number is a constant reminder that our reference point is the Exodus from Egypt. The redemption from Egypt, as the Ramban puts it. Later in our history, after the Babylonian exile, we acquired different names for the months. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, the names that we use to this day. Ramban says all those names are Babylonian and Syrian names. And the Jews brought those names back with them when they returned from the Babylonian exile at the beginning of the Second Temple period. Call it, if you will, the age of Purim. Which is why, by the way, in Megillat Esther, we always use both systems of reference. Haman throws down the lot, B'chodesh Harishon hu Chodesh Nisan. And the messengers go out, B'chodesh HaShalishi hu Chodesh Sivan. And the decree of destruction is for Chodesh Nemasar hu Chodesh Adar. As if to appeal to both readers. The readers who know the old system, of months that have numbers, and the readers that know the new system of months that have names. And Megillat Esther, the age of Purim, is the pivot point as we move from the old system to the new. So we mention both. Nachmanides says there's a reason why we chose to bring those names back with us. Why? Because there was a second redemption in Jewish history. Not the redemption from Egypt, but the redemption from Babylon. That was also a redemptive moment. Kasher alinu mi Bavel, when we came up from Babylon, and the prophecy in Jeremiah was fulfilled, the day will come when the people of Israel will commemorate not the exodus from Egypt, but the return from the northern lands. We took those names with us in order to remind us that there we were, umisham ha'elanu Hashem yitbarach, and God brought us forth in a moment of redemption from that exile in Babylon and in Persia. What a profound thought that the Ramban is offering us. So the names of the months that we use to this day no longer commemorate the exodus from Egypt, the first redemption, but actually the exodus from Babylon, the second. Without stating it, the Ramban is actually indicating that there's a fundamental difference between these two redemptive moments. The exodus from Egypt was a moment of supernatural redemption. The plagues rained down and Pharaoh relented, and the Jews went forth triumphantly and made their way, guided by the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. That's called the exodus from Egypt. But the exodus from Babylon, we had to wait for permission from Cyrus, who overthrew the Babylonians, as Ezra mentioned. We didn't go forth with some sort of supernatural divine guidance. And guess what? Most Jews didn't go forth at all. A small number left the comforts of Babylon and Persia behind and traveled westwards to the backwater known as the province of Yahud, which was in ruins. So it was redemptive, all right, but there was nothing overt. It was a redemption of God intervening in the most covert way imaginable through the agency of a pagan king called Cyrus. And the Ramban is basically indicating to us not only the nature of the second redemption, but the nature of the transformation in human history which took place, i.e., the redemption from Babylon ushered in a new chapter, a chapter in which God's intervention and God's involvement would no longer be overt or obvious. He would be written out of the story, so to speak, because that's the nature of human history at this point, and so it has been ever since. So those names remind us of that redemption, but that redemption was a different redemption than the redemption from Egypt. It was a redemption in which God effectively was not to be seen. And that became, as it were, the touchstone of Jewish history to this very day. So we mark that, as it were. We mark that new condition, that new watershed, by recalling the events of the Megillah. But even as we recall them, we remove God from the story. Obviously, we appreciate the implications of that. To remove God from the story is also to allow human beings the opportunity to take the initiative in a way that Moses and Aaron could never have dreamed of, because they operated in a system of overt divine intervention. And in that system, there was little room for human beings to be agents, even agents of redemption. But in Megillat Esther, Astaire becomes the heroine. She unleashes that redemptive moment, and Mordecai will follow it up. As it were, there is now room for them to operate as free, thoughtful, choosing human beings in order to unleash, as it were, the redemption that the Jewish people need. That's the essence of Purim. And that has been the essence of Jewish history ever since. Which is another way of saying, as much as God receives, it is up to us, including the people in this shiur, to become the agents of redemption in the world. That's the implication. By the way, I should point out, I do not think for a moment that God's retreat means God's absence. God guides events. God intervenes covertly. God ensures on a redemptive outcome such that the Jewish people are saved. But none of it is obvious. In fact, if I were to ask the people in this room, out of all the cast of characters in Megillat Esther, who are the least likely candidates to be unleashing redemption in the story? I'd say it's pretty obvious who the least likely candidates are. Achashverosh and Haman. What do they have to do with redemption? If you were to ask me, what is the least likely context for redemption to be unleashed in the story? I would say a drunken feast. What would God be doing at a drunken feast? And yet it is precisely this combination, and only this combination, which unleashes the divine involvement in the process of redemption. I don't know who the first one to notice this in the Megillah was, but a long time ago, somebody noticed that in spite of the fact that God's name is not mentioned, God's name is mentioned explicitly. And it's precisely in the context of a feast, and it's precisely in the context of Achashverosh and Haman, and it's precisely in the context of timing, which is always critical for a redemptive intervention. Chapter 5, verse 4, Esther will invite the king and Haman to a feast. Ultimately, it will be the turning point of the story. Vatomer Esther imal hamelech tov, if it suits the king, may the king and Haman come today to the feast which I have prepared for him. Yavo hamelech vehaman hayom. These four words begin with four letters, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, which are the letters associated with God's name. As if to say, God was present the entire time, even in the most likely moments. The king and Haman will come today to the feast, and God's intervention will be unleashed. So God might be overt, but he's never absent. For those of you that like chiastic structures, the Megillah preserves the ultimate chiastic structure. Going to the narrative events for a moment, there's no time to do it in detail, but just note that there are exactly 10 feasts in the Megillah. One at the beginning for the ministers and servants, and for the people of Shushan, Vashti's feast for the women, Esther's feast on the occasion of her coronation, Haman and the king's feast, celebrating the decree of destroying the Jews. Those are the first 5. All 5 of them lead in the same direction of Haman ascendant. These are followed by 5 other feasts, which change the trajectory of the story. Esther's first feast, Yavo HaMelech VaHaman Hayom, that I mentioned, in which, as it were, the divine energy is unleashed. Her second feast, in which Haman is exposed. The third feast, when the Jews find out that they can defend themselves. And 2 final feasts, where the Jews celebrate. The Jews of the realm, the Jews of Shushan. The people of the realm, the ministers and servants of Shushan. 5 feasts before, 5 feasts afterwards, and right in the middle is the 3-day fast. That is another way of saying that God is at the center of the story. Even as all of the feasting orbits around the story of the Megillah, at the core is a fast. Because that fast is about connecting or reconnecting to God. In essence, what turns the 5 feasts of destruction into the 5 feasts of redemption is that turning point of the fast in between. It works better in English. Fasting is transformed into feasts. That becomes, as it were, the moment for God's reintroduction to the story. So God is present in his absence. God is involved in his covertness. God's receding is the invitation for us to take action. Bayamim hahem hazman hazeh. I'm going to stop there for now. Fine.